The morning I came home from my second round of chemo, my husband was ironing his shirt. Not the wrinkled one he'd worn to the hospital waiting room, a fresh one, pale blue. The kind he saved for client dinners. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom with my tote bag still on my shoulder and my hospital bracelet still on my wrist. And I watched him run the iron back and forth like nothing in the world was wrong. Like I hadn't just spent 4 days hooked up to an IV while my body tried to remember how to be a body. "You're back," he said. He didn't look up. I said yes. I told him my dad had picked me up since he hadn't answered his phone. He said he'd been in meetings. He said it the way you say, "Of course the sky is blue." Like the explanation was so obvious it was almost insulting that I'd brought it up. I sat down on the edge of the bed. My legs were still weak. The anti-nausea medication made everything feel slightly sideways, like the floor was about 2 inches lower than I expected it to be. I watched him button his cuffs and thought, there is something wrong here. Not just with this moment, with all of it. I'd thought that before. I didn't push it down. This time. Let me back up. My name is not important to this story. What's important is that I was 31 years old. I had stage 2 breast cancer, and I was married to a man I'll call my husband, because that's what he still was legally at that point, and because the word husband carries a weight that I want you to feel every time I use it. We'd been married 4 years. We met when I was 26, at a fundraiser for a children's hospital that my company sponsored. He was charming, he was funny. He wore his success lightly in a way that I found genuinely attractive, because I dated men who wore it like a crown, and I was tired of crowns. My dad liked him, that mattered to me. My dad is not a man who gives approval easily. He spent 30 years building a commercial real estate business from a single rental property in Columbus, Ohio. And he has the instincts of someone who has been lied to by men in good suits enough times to develop a very refined detector for it. He shook my husband's hand at Thanksgiving that first year and said, afterward, he seemed solid. I thought, if my dad thinks he's solid, he's solid. I was wrong. But I didn't know that yet. We got married 2 years later. Small ceremony, backyard of my parents' house, 60 people, fireflies in July. I wore my grandmother's earrings. My best friend, the one who'd talked me through every relationship I'd ever had, stood next to me and held my bouquet when I cried. The first year was good. The second year was fine. By the third year, I had started to notice things I couldn't quite name. Small withdrawals. Moments where he was present in the room but somehow not there. A way he had of making me feel like my needs were a mild inconvenience he was generously tolerating. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself all marriages go through dry spells. I told myself the things women tell themselves when they've built a life with someone, and the alternative is too big to look at directly. Then I found the lump. October. I was in the shower. I almost missed it. My gynecologist referred me to a breast surgeon, who referred me to an oncologist, who sat across a desk from me and used words like infiltrating ductal carcinoma and treatment plan, and good prognosis if we move quickly. I was alone at that appointment. My husband had a conference call. He said he couldn't reschedule. My best friend drove 45 minutes from the other side of the city to sit in the waiting room anyway. She didn't ask. She just showed up. I walked out of that office with a folder full of pamphlets, and she took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug in the middle of the oncology waiting room and held on until I stopped shaking. My husband took me to dinner that night. Nice place. He ordered wine. He told me we were going to get through this, and he said it in a way that sounded like a performance. Like he'd been practicing it in the car. I remember thinking, when did I start being able to tell the difference? Surgery first, then chemo. My oncologist recommended 4 cycles of ACT, which is a combination of drugs with names I learned to pronounce and side effects I learned to manage, and a timeline that stretched from November to the following March. My hair started falling out after the first cycle. I found that out on a Tuesday. I cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes, then I called my best friend, then I called my mom, and then I went back to work because I had a presentation at 2 o'clock. My husband took me to 1 chemo session. The first one. He sat next to me for about 45 minutes, checked his phone 11 times. I counted. I don't know why I counted, but I did, and then said he had to take a call and stepped into the hallway. He came back to drive me home. He asked how I was feeling. I said tired. He said, well, rest up, and went to his home office. My dad drove me to the second one, and the third, and the fourth. So, the morning of cycle 2, day 4. My husband was ironing his shirt. I asked him where he was going. He said his firm had a client dinner. He'd mentioned it, he said. I probably just didn't remember because of the medication. He said this gently, carefully, the way you say something when you want the other person to believe they're the unreliable one. I thought about the medication. I thought about the way chemo fog works, the way it softens the edges of things. And then I thought, no, I would have remembered this. I always remember. I asked if he could cancel. He said he couldn't. He said this client was important. He said I'd be fine for one evening. Didn't I have everything I needed here at home? I looked at him standing there in our bedroom with his pale blue shirt and his careful expression, and I said, yes. I said I'd be fine. He left at 6:30. I heard his car back out of the driveway. I sat on the couch and I opened my laptop and I looked up the restaurant he'd mentioned. He'd said the client had picked it. Upscale steakhouse downtown, the kind of place you book 2 months in advance. I looked it up. It was a real place. It had good reviews. I don't know what made me look further. Instinct, maybe. Or maybe I was just tired of being the unreliable one. I opened our joint banking app, and there it was. My husband made good money. I made good money too. I was a senior project manager at an architecture firm, and I had been since I was 28, which I worked hard for and was proud of. We had joint accounts for household expenses and separate accounts for personal spending, which had always seemed like a sensible arrangement. What I was looking at was not the joint account. What I was looking at was a credit card statement I'd never seen before, linked to the app because my husband had set up the account and apparently added it to our profile without thinking, or maybe thinking I'd never look. The card was in his name. The statements went back 14 months. 14 months. I sat there with my blanket pulled up over my lap and my anti-nausea medication on the coffee table, and I scrolled through 14 months of charges on a credit card I didn't know existed. Hotel stays. Not the kind for business trips. I could see his actual business expenses on the account we shared, and they didn't match these locations, these dates. A weekend in Nashville in February when he'd told me he was in Chicago for a conference, 4 nights in Scottsdale in April when I was in my 3rd week post-surgery and my mom was sleeping on our guest room pullout because I couldn't be alone. Restaurants, jewelry, a spa in Napa. I want to be careful about what I say here because I didn't know for certain what I was looking at, but I knew what I was looking at. I closed the app. I opened it again. Then I called my dad. He picked up on the second ring. He always picks up on the second ring. He says the first ring is for deciding if you want to answer. The second ring is when you know. I said, Dad, I think something is wrong. I think it's been wrong for a long time and I just didn't see it. There was a silence. Not a confused silence, a listening silence. The kind that means, I'm here, keep going. I told him about the credit card. I told him about the dates. I told him about Nashville and Scottsdale and the jewelry receipts from a store I'd never been taken to. He said, Where are you right now? I said, Home. He said, I'm coming. He drove an hour and 40 minutes. He came through the front door with my mom and a container of the chicken soup she'd been making me, and a look on his face that I recognized. I'd seen it once when I was 9 years old, and a boy in my class had pushed me down on the playground, and my dad had gone to the school the next morning with that exact expression. He sat across from me at our kitchen table and I showed him everything on the laptop screen. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, Do you have a family attorney? I said we had a shared estate attorney who had done our wills. He said, Not that one. He said, You need your own. He made a call from our kitchen. I don't know who he called. Someone he'd worked with, someone he trusted. 20 minutes later, he gave me a name and a direct number and said, She expects your call first thing tomorrow morning. Her name is not important to this story either. What's important is that she was very, very good. My husband came home at 10:45. He looked surprised to see my parents there. He recovered quickly. He was always good at recovering quickly. He said hello to my mom, shook my dad's hand. He said he hadn't realized they were coming. My dad said, We wanted to make sure she got home from the hospital okay. My husband said, She got home fine. I checked in with her this afternoon. He had, in fact, sent me a text at 3:14 that said, "Hope you're resting." I had a 3-second voice memo from him as well, sent at 6:08, saying he hoped the evening wasn't too quiet. My dad looked at him for a moment, then he said goodnight, and he and my mom left. My husband asked if everything was okay. I said yes. I said I was tired. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and I thought about 14 months of hotel rooms and a weekend in Scottsdale, while my mom slept in the guest room, so someone would be there if I needed help in the night. I thought about the pale blue shirt. I thought about 11 phone checks in 45 minutes. I didn't sleep. I called the attorney the next morning. She was calm in a way that felt like structure. Like talking to her was itself a kind of scaffolding. She asked me what I had and I told her. Screenshots of the credit card statements, the dates, the amounts. She asked if I had access to our joint financial accounts. I said yes. She said, "Don't move anything, don't close anything, just document everything you can see." She also said, "Do you have a prenuptial agreement?" I did. My dad had suggested it before the wedding, and my husband had agreed without much pushback, which I had thought at the time was a sign of good character. The attorney asked me to send it to her. I did. She called me back 2 hours later and she said, "The prenuptial agreement is very clear. Your separate assets, including anything you inherited, anything you brought into the marriage, and anything you can demonstrate you earned and kept separate, are protected." She said, "He has no claim to your individual retirement accounts, your premarital savings, or your ownership stake in the property your father put in your name." I hadn't known my dad had put property in my name. He'd done it quietly, years before the wedding, when I'd been too young to pay much attention to the paperwork. A small commercial unit in a building he owned. He'd been holding it in trust for me and had transferred it before the marriage without making a thing of it. I sat with that for a moment. My dad had been protecting me before I knew I needed protecting. The attorney had a contact, a licensed investigator she worked with regularly. She recommended him not to dig up scandal, but to establish a documented record. Because, she said, what I was looking at would involve more than infidelity. Marital assets had been used. There was a question of whether funds had been misrepresented on joint tax returns. I authorized it. I didn't tell my husband. What the investigator found, over the next 3 weeks while I was recovering from my second cycle and trying to keep soup down and sleeping 12 hours a night, was this. My husband had been in a relationship with someone for approximately 16 months. He had spent. The investigator's documentation was precise, slightly over $22,000 on this relationship over that time. Some of it from his personal account and some of it from a home equity line of credit that was in both our names and that I had not been told was being drawn on. A home equity line of credit, a debt instrument secured by our shared home. He had used it without my knowledge or consent to fund a hidden relationship while I was being treated for cancer. The attorney, when I told her, was quiet for 2 seconds. Then she said, "This changes things considerably. I want to tell you what it felt like to sit across from my husband at our kitchen table the night I told him I knew. He'd made dinner. He did that sometimes. A gesture, a performance, something to put between himself and the vague guilt that I now understood he'd been carrying for over a year. He'd made pasta. There was garlic bread. He'd opened a bottle of wine I hadn't asked for. I waited until he sat down, then I slid the folder across the table. He looked at it. He didn't open it. He said, "What is this?" I said, "You know what it is. There's a thing that happens in those moments that nobody warns you about. The other person tries to find the version of the story where they are still okay, where there is still an explanation, a misunderstanding, a context you're missing. You can watch them moving through the options in real time." He tried 3 of them. The credit card was for something else. The dates were work trips that had been moved. He'd planned to tell me. I said, "There's a HELOC draw of $11,000 from 7 months ago. What is your explanation for that?" He stopped. He said, "I can explain that." I said, "I know, but it doesn't matter anymore." I told him my attorney's name. I told him she would be contacting his attorney within the week. I told him the prenuptial agreement was clear and that I had documentation of unauthorized draws from our joint credit line, which my attorney had advised me constituted a breach that would be relevant in the settlement discussions. He said, "You don't have to do this," I said. "I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to." He said, "After everything we've been through." I said, "Yes. After everything we've been through." My best friend was parked outside in her car. I had texted her the word now, and she came through the back door and stood in the kitchen doorway. And the look on her face when she saw him was the look of a woman who had driven 45 minutes to a waiting room for me and had not said a single word to make it about herself. My husband left that night. He took 2 bags. He left the garlic bread. The legal process was not fast and it was not simple, and I am not going to tell you it was painless because that would be a lie. There were weeks where I was recovering from chemo and also reading documents and also trying to keep my job and also trying to remember who I was outside of all of it. But here is what the prenuptial agreement did. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. My separate assets were mine. The retirement accounts I'd been contributing to since I was 23, mine. The ownership stake in my dad's building, which had, it turned out, appreciated considerably, mine. My individual savings protected. The HELOC draw was a different matter. My attorney pursued it. The settlement reflected it. I will not share the exact number, but I will tell you that my husband had anticipated a very different outcome, and what he got instead was the result of his own documentation, his own paper trail, his own credit card statements in his own name, on an account he'd been careless about. He had thought I wasn't paying attention. He had thought the medication made me foggy. He had underestimated, significantly, my dad. I finished my last chemo cycle on a Thursday in March. My dad drove me. My best friend met us at the cancer center with a balloon that said "done" in gold letters, and a box of the very specific brand of crackers I'd been able to eat throughout treatment, and the 3 of us sat in the parking lot in the pale early spring sun. And I ate a cracker and I cried, and nobody said anything for a long time, because there wasn't anything to say that was big enough. My oncologist told me, "My scans looked good," she said. "We're cautiously optimistic," she said. "Come back in 3 months." I am cautiously optimistic too. I have decided to be. My hair is growing back. It's different from before, softer, a little curlier, like my body came back from what it went through and decided to make some changes without consulting me. I'm choosing to take that as a metaphor. I am 32 years old. I live in an apartment I chose for myself, on the 6th floor, with windows that face east so I get the morning light. My best friend has a key. My parents come for dinner on Sundays sometimes, and my dad sits in the chair by the window and drinks his coffee and doesn't say much, and I think that is, maybe, the purest form of love. Someone just being in the room with you, not needing it to be anything more than that. The divorce was finalized last month. I signed the papers on a Tuesday, and then I went to work because I had a 2 o'clock presentation, and when it was over, my best friend picked me up and we drove to a park near my apartment, and we walked around the lake until the sun went down, and she held my hand the whole way. I had thought for a while that the hardest thing would be finding out the truth. Then I thought the hardest thing would be fighting for what was mine. Then I thought the hardest thing would be finishing chemo, while everything else was happening at once. I've decided to stop deciding which part was hardest. What I know is this: I am still here. I called my dad when I needed to, and he came, and that changed everything. I had a piece of paper signed 4 years ago. That meant I walked out of that marriage with what I had walked into it with and everything I'd built since. I had a best friend who showed up without being asked so many times I lost count. The pale blue shirt is not mine to worry about anymore. The morning light comes through my east-facing windows right now as I'm writing this, and the crackers are on my kitchen counter, and I have a scan in 6 weeks. I am, cautiously and completely, okay.